highly technocratic, and authoritarian. These are but some of the adjectives that have been frequently used to describe the city-state and governance of Singapore. I know this definitely holds true in my own conversations that I've had with people. Generally, Singapore isn't known to be a liberal place or a place that fosters civil activism. Not known to be liberal or to be a place that fosters civil activism. Let that sink in. My name is Ryan, and today I'm going to share a little bit of my research on the potentiality of civil activism in Singapore. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how the socio-political climate in Singapore has limited, paved the way forward for, and otherwise shaped LGBTQ activism. Speaking of socio-political climate, I will be exploring the illiberal climate in Singapore through something called illiberal pragmatics. Illiberal pragmatics is a theory, or what I would deem a fancy term for a particular kind of governing philosophy based on pragmatism. This term has recently gained traction in discourse about communitarian societies in Asia. It was coined by Singaporean sociologists as a lens through which we can begin to understand the at times liberal, at times illiberal, and otherwise ideologically inconsistent policies of Singapore. As you can tell, I'm already alluding to a belief that my research has led me to, that Singapore's governance isn't fundamentally liberal or illiberal, and you'll see why shortly. Since illiberal pragmatics is based on pragmatism, allow me to briefly introduce this pragmatism. Singaporean sociologist Beng Huat Chua outlines the pragmatist governing mindset as an ideology that embodies a vigorous economic development orientation that emphasizes science and technology and centralized rational public administration. Under this view, economic development prevails above all else, which makes sense given how resource-strapped and bleak prospects were for Singapore at its time of founding about 50 years ago. Policies were chiefly utilitarian in the economic sense and mostly contextual and non-ideological. Economic pragmatism led to policy decisions being justified as natural, necessary, and realistic. And this is exactly what illiberal pragmatics is. If a policy decision is illiberal, it is only because it is pragmatically so. The liberal or illiberal nature of a policy isn't a concern, and that is why illiberal pragmatics is a powerful tool to understand ideologically inconsistent policy decisions. So why did I introduce illiberal pragmatics? Well, as I've mentioned, Singapore has gained some infamy for its illiberal laws and policies, and for having an otherwise illiberal governance. This becomes especially apparent when people try to draw parallels between Singapore and similarly economically successful capitalist countries of the West. However, my research has shown me that through the lens of illiberal pragmatics, we can see that policy decisions in Singapore are hardly fundamentally or ideologically illiberal. What I argue then is that illiberal pragmatics has ironically, or perhaps unsurprisingly by the end of this presentation, paved the way forward for liberal change to occur. The way forward for LGBTQ rights in Singapore has many barriers. You may have heard of the limited freedom of expression in the country, and you'd be right. There is a lot of curtailment of free speech and activism. Due to policies like the Public Order Act, the Societies Act, and so forth, common activist tactics have been rendered unfeasible. With a weak opposition political force, campaigning for change by exerting political pressure is also not likely to succeed. But that doesn't mean that there is no way forward. I wish I could present my entire research, but for the sake of time, this presentation focuses only on the legal aspects of LGBTQ activism and the ways we could exploit illiberal pragmatics to achieve progress in the legal aspects. I want to start off with the most hotly contested piece of legislation in recent LGBTQ history in Singapore, Section 377A of the Penal Code. It's a law that criminalizes sex or gross indecency between consenting male adults and otherwise homosexual behavior. Now you might be thinking, wow, really? All that talk about illiberal pragmatics in Singapore not really being illiberal? How is this not illiberal? And I totally understand. That used to be my stance too. It looks illiberal, it sounds illiberal, but the reality of it is that actually this law doesn't even get enforced. So why does it exist? For one, 377A is a remnant of colonial British law that has, for whatever reason, extended into Singapore's independence. This is no mundane topic of discussion. Though opinions are quickly changing, for many people in Singapore, the LGBTQ lifestyle is still taboo. Repealing this law hence carries immense symbolic weight, and would require having a critical mass of Singaporeans being outraged enough to call for a repeal, and not just having a critical mass of Singaporeans merely being accepting of the LGBTQ community. Until there is a critical mass of outrage, the status quo will prevail. And that has remained true. There simply hasn't been enough public outrage over 377A. It remains pragmatic for the government to err on the side of caution and support the perceived conservative majority, or to not rock the boat. More significantly, if we look at the government response to LGBTQ-related campaigns, we can also see that the government is amenable to liberal change, but believes it's not the prudent choice. Remember when I said 377A doesn't actually get enforced? Take a look at a government statement released in 2007. Given the majority view, the law remains on the books, but the government does not and will not enforce 377A. And here's another quote from the Prime Minister right after he refuted appeals to repeal 377A. They are our kith and kin. They too must have a place in this society, and they too are entitled to their private lives. We shouldn't make it harder than it already is for them to grow up and live in a society where they are different from most Singaporeans. In terms of ideology, there is clearly an uneasy position that the Singapore government is adopting. This is clearly an attempt to please both sides and to err on the side of political caution and to support the perceived conservative majority by maintaining the status quo. But that's not to say that the LGBTQ community was never persecuted by the authorities in Singapore. But even then, tracing these persecutions, we see that none of the persecutions were colored by a state-backed illiberal ideology. For example, in 1993, the police conducted a raid on a disco club that was known to be gay only on Sunday and apprehended a number of people. Although quite clearly a targeted attack on the LGBTQ community, none of the accounts of arrest had anything officially to do with their sexual orientations or identities, or 377A, but rather they all involved something benign like not having identification papers on them. After receiving complaints from the LGBTQ community regarding these arrests, the authorities issued an apology, but only for the unorderly behavior of their policemen. Still, we can see the lack of illiberal state backing for the actions of the police. Also related to queer spaces is the allowing of clearly LGBTQ-oriented regional parties to happen from the year 2000 to 2004, when it was ultimately banned due to the complaints about openly gay acts at such events. Many of these events that lasted merely a few days each easily generated about 6 million in revenue. The fact that such clearly LGBTQ-themed events were allowed to run initially shows that the state didn't care too much about the nature of these events. Put another way, the state was willing to turn a blind eye to the nature of these events so long as they were productive to economic gain. The ban of these parties may come across as illiberal, but we see again that it only happened when the public complaints reached a serious enough magnitude. Again, illiberal pragmatics at play here. Audrey Rear, the sociologist who came up with the term illiberal pragmatics in the first place, made similar arguments about this governing philosophy being the reason the LGBTQ community or scene wasn't extinguished during its early days. The entertainment, cultural, and entrepreneurial value that they brought was deemed productive to the economic concerns of the state. Given these pragmatic views of the issue, the punchline here is that this then gives way to the possible avenues we might be able to use illiberal pragmatics to come up with the strategies and arguments to achieve progress for the LGBTQ community and beyond. For example, I can imagine Singaporeans readily accepting more human rights-based arguments for legislative change. Specifically, it is possible to call for more anti-discrimination laws and to, for example, expand the basis of anti-discrimination to include grounds of sex, gender, sexual orientation, and sexual identity. Just look at the anti-discrimination article in Singapore's constitution, which protects characteristics limited to religion, race, descent, and place of birth, which is a far cry from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in the US. Note how Article 12 doesn't even cover gender or sex. An argument that this would bolster meritocracy and foster greater healthy competition, as well as forge a more welcoming environment for international talent to work in, would grant this a lot of pragmatic and economic power. This is but one of the many ways that illiberal pragmatics could create powerful arguments that would justify the liberalization of Singapore, and each of these paths could be an entire presentation on their own. I hope that having heard my presentation thus far, you are as hopeful as I am about the potential for liberal change in Singapore. There is great momentum in the changing attitudes and rationalities in the world, which has had spillover effects in Singapore. The paths forward seem clear and more open than they have ever been. Thank you for listening.